Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Aaron Lowry. He's been a consultant for 15 years, and this is the third time, I believe, on the Crazy Wisdom show. So welcome to the show.
Hey, Stewart, great to see you again, man. I always enjoy our conversation, so looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm loving the fact that you got sorry. So yeah, really excited to get your take because last time we spoke, I was living in the California mountains in a strange situation, and now I'm halfway across the world in Buenos Aires in another strange situation, but a much better strange situation this time. And last time we talked, I was on this train of thought of like I was going to a co how do you call it, makerspace. I was going to a makerspace and I was trying to make all this stuff in the physical world. And I was just like, I had tried coding before and that was extremely complex. And then I started trying to make physical things and that was even way more complex. So you always gave me great advice in that. And as maybe many of my listeners won't see this, but you got a whole giant car shop in the back behind you. And so you work every day building things. So I love hearing about that. I guess what's in the past year in terms of either building hardware or software, and by hardware I mean physical stuff. What have you learned?
I haven't had any exposure at all to software development projects at all in this past year. It's been a couple years since I've done anything in that front. Um, and I haven't done anything to really with digital hardware, right? Just some, basic little home 3D printing projects, some stuff like that, modifications to hardware I already had, that kind of thing, right? Upgrades. So the thing that I would say probably makes or has been the most insightful, especially in regard to kind of like this context here, this environment, is it gives me a good bedrock of embodiment. Um, there's a kind of an imperative when you do work with, say sheet metal. For instance, I mean, there's some good examples of that behind me here. It's actually not my favorite thing to work on by any means. I'd rather be fabricating new things or, engineering, designing, that kind of thing. Sheet metal work is tedious. And a lot of people who see me do it think I'm patient and they're like, yeah, I could never do it. And like, it's actually, I'm not really that patient. I'm just kind of driven by an attempt towards perfectionism. And the nature of it just drives you to, if you try to rush it, you'll take longer, right? So like the best, most effective way to achieve the results that you want, which is, say you patch in a new panel, you're going to fit a new piece. It needs to fit all the seams as closely as possible. Then as you weld it, you're going to weld it, really deliberately and try to maintain and minimize heat, warpage, shrinkage, all these kind of things, because these dynamics are constantly going on. And it's just like the fundamental principles that drive those are thermodynamics and,
Mm.
the physical properties of the material world. And you can fight them or you can kind of try to orient yourself with them and figure out what are the properties and how do they respond in different ways. And so I would say that's probably the most, I mean, because that type of a sensitivity to that is something that you can then try to apply, not just try, but you can actively apply in all other ranges of life. Because it's very much it's a reciprocal process of constantly fine tuning and course correcting and attunement to say the applicable principles
Mm.
in whatever the environment is.
That's very good. And it feels like that's being lost. I definitely had to learn that process slowly, given I was one of the first generations to be on the computer, to be on the internet, and that immediate access to information that's somehow different than what what most of my ancestors have been able to do, some way short-circuited the ability to interact and kind of be like, because I don't have that patience, but and I get what you said. It's basically, it's not just patience, it's also just like, well, you have this thing that you want to do, and that thing requires you to do this thing. And there's all these properties of it that make it very challenging. And so that's super interesting. I've been watching The Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which I know you've watched a lot too. I'm rewatching it again, and it's so good. And I love your language of attunement, reciprocal process. Um, I'm really curious about your thoughts on AI as somebody who hasn't been. I know that you've been tracking it, but I know you haven't been like building things on it. And I'm so curious as an outsider what you think about what's going on with AI.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's probably one of the top of the list kind of awareness items since the last time we talked, right? Like there's been more development in that area, at least publicly and public facing than anything else probably in broad tech or anything. So you and I have discussed it a little bit, both on Twitter and directly and whatnot, right? So we've got some context already, and like you just mentioned, like I do absolutely resort to some Vervaekian language here and there, and it's very useful for this kind of discussion, right? Like John's doing a bunch of work in AI still, and um, he recently talked to my brother and
Hmm.
and Pajot and Schindler
Hmm.
on my brother Ken's channel. I sent
Oh,
you, I think, a
cool.
link to that. Maybe to check that out. Like,
Yeah.
um, because there's a blending of sort of a Neoplatonist and Orthodox
Mm.
and then all these kind of backgrounds kind of bring it together, right? And John's there, sort of supporting the same kind of the essay that he put out like 10 months ago, something like that, right? A little more um, full flesh, robust presentation of it. And I do actually have some, I think, differences and contentions for sure with John, and just like the way that I perceive the whole thing and how that how that causes the say the potential for the future to lay itself out, right? Like what are the realistic bounds of the application of the technology? Like what is hype? What is
Mm.
fear mongering? What
Mm.
is like how many of what is the actually like the true contextualization of the technology that we're talking about? Because um, intelligence is a really um, I think challenging thing to articulate, especially in a broad spectrum context. We tend to use it oftentimes to describe a lot of different things. Um, and so it's not really clear what we mean by intelligence. And then artificial, I think just it's messy, right? Like the whole thing gets really messy. And so I think basically that it does give us, I'll start with this. I think it really gives us a very good, probably the highest resolution mirror we've ever built
Mm.
to look back at ourselves with.
Yes.
And I think that to be really clear, like I don't think that we understand intelligence, and I don't think we understand consciousness. And therefore, I don't think we have any business projecting this as general artificial intelligence or anything like that. Although I think it's tremendously powerful.
Yeah.
So, um, and I guess the the next thing to do, I guess, is talk about why I think, like why do I think that it doesn't lay itself out quite the way it's being mostly presented. And for that, I ground in something like initially in the idea of intelligibility.
Mm.
When I'm trying to think about what is intelligence, then I start to think about like well, it's clearly it's an ability to grapple with the intelligible, right? And to
Mhm.
process whatever is intelligible,
Mhm.
right? And like you can go into a lot of the cog sci on like how we then filter and break down and attribute, like weigh all kinds of information in these environments, because there's far more, right, than we can actually process or even appreciate. So you can, go into the ideas of relevance realization and salience landscaping and some of these ideas. But so then for me, all of those start to then ground out in the biological interface, right? The human body, the sensory systems to which it's tuned, those to which it's not tuned, right? And the way that those kind of sculpt what lays itself out to us as the intelligible world. And then maybe on top of that idea, you layer on what is intelligence, right? Intelligence is
Mm.
this capacity to process these things and to do your pattern recognition and say, I think a lot of this leads right into sort of a left brain hemisphere kind of processing model where things are structured and you have relatively clean paths of connectivity between different uh, all kinds of different nodes within a contextual environment, all kinds of different information. It has its ways to fit together. You're able to reduce your contemplation of novelty and just operate at a fairly rapid and clean
Mm.
pace. And so that, like that seems to me something like intelligence, but it's still really, really far from capturing anything like what a human being is, right? And the way that that reciprocal agent arena process kind of plays out when you think, you know, here's the interface, the intelligence, and for to get into the other side of it, right? The consciousness, right? Because the consciousness seems to have a pretty strong role to play in how we define intelligibility and intelligence and all these things, but it's not the same layer, right? It's not the same thing. And and so I think, that's in broad strokes kind of the way that I kind of look at how these things sort of lay themselves out. And so in that environment, then you kind of take the practical aspects of what is being done that is being called AI. And, at a fundamental level, this is machine learning. It's reapplied through different mechanisms with different patterns, sometimes um, algorithmically, sometimes with a human reinforcement or feedback layer, right? But you take a constrained pool of data and you draw parameters about it to tell it what is relevant, in a sense, right? You create a salience landscape for it. Like somebody has to build this layer to create the salience landscape for the relevance of the information within the data set.
Yeah.
And we look at that and you get tables and weightings and like all these kind of things, right? And they're dynamic and it's really complex, and it's amazing where we've gotten it to now, right? It works really, really well especially when it's fairly unfiltered.
Yes. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
but I love the fact that it's been becoming filtered, and then it's losing a lot of its utility through that filtering process. And I suspect they don't understand, the people who are doing that type of reinforcement feedback don't really understand what's happening inside the model based on all of the reinforcement they're doing to try to fit Pandora's box back into the box. And this is where prompt injecting also is really interesting. We had a AI Whisperers Club meet up 3 weeks ago, and we tried playing Cards Against Humanity, but instead of having the cards as the answers to the prompts for Cards Against Humanity, we had the AI make up the responses,
mhm.
and then we ran right into the reinforcement learning, the guardrails that have been put on the AI, and it wasn't spicy like Cards Against Humanity was, and And so then somebody in this group of 30 people went on GitHub and shared in the WhatsApp channel the way that you prompt inject. And it was really easy. You just copy and paste it from the GitHub. And then everybody inside the group was prompt injecting so that they could get Cards Against Humanity, better responses. And it's just so leaky. And like there's no way this thing is being put back in the box. And they're going to try to put it back in the box. And this goes into our conversations we've had before about decentralization, which is just that decentralization, open source feel like it's just there's going to be no competition. But of course, I think both of us ideologically agree with that. But if you don't disagree with it, I'd love to hear that too as well. Or if you don't agree with that, I'd love to hear that as well. What do you think about all that?
I don't think that you can or should have any expectation of interfacing with a data set like this without some layer of filtering.
That's
It's
true.
always just a question of what.
Yep.
And the more you know about the deterministic parameters that have been put around the data to create a contextual environment where it can provide relevant information, the better informed you can be about how to interact with it. So, you know, the public language models are, you know, clearly closed source, right? And so you're not going to ever have any sort of real visibility on what's being done at that level. And even in a closed source model or an open source model, right, that you run locally or something like that, there's still the necessity to define some of these kind of parameters, right? And like having visibility on them is important or it's very useful. But I don't think there's a way, you know, if you just have a database and you populate it full of all kinds of data, regardless of what type of data it is, right? Like you have to tell it how to make sense of it in some way, like how to arrange it, whether it's the columns, the rows, the formatting, however, right? And how you tie it together. And that's what we're doing in a really complex and dynamic way, you know, in these language models or any sort of, you know, say image models or any of these things. And so then you get to say like the prompt injection aspect of it, right? Because that's say a linguistic, because we interface with them through language, right? Like you've recognized, but with some probing, kind of where the limitations are of the system, and then it's just a matter of whether you trick it in a sense, or you ask it really nicely in a sense, or one way or another, like, or you just recontextualize the question you're asking in a way where it can still be given or responded to relevantly without being responded to directly.
Yes.
Right? Like you can still actually get the information you want. It just can't tell you using the words that you need it, you know, you would want it to use or something like that, right? And,
Yeah.
like I've heard some people who feel like that's kind of a malicious thing, and like I don't think it's just a I think it's a response to the way that the systems are built, and they're full of this information, right? And you know that it's in there, especially once you start to do this, right? And then like I don't know, a little ways down the road, you get a pretty good feel for like how can you walk your way through the gates, even if they've been staggered in the different fences between you and the data.
Yeah.
At least in order to get to the place where you can draw the lines to contextualize it so that it can give you what you're actually looking for.
It's so funny. It's like arguing with a child, or kind of having these debates with children about motivating them and figuring out how to do it. And it's just so, and it's so funny that because I was totally blown away by the fact that this was a language model. Like I thought AI was all about self-driving cars and understanding the vision. And then they come in and they figure out how to make this other sense of ours that most people don't even consider a sense, which is our linguistic ability to communicate. And then they just totally own it. And it's such an interesting thing. And I think it surprised a lot of people. Certainly surprised me. Did it surprise you?
I've been impressed by it. I don't know that I've been totally surprised, actually. Although I not I haven't made projections or predictions about it or anything like that,
Yeah.
right? That I could, I haven't been, I haven't at any point been directly plugged into the AI or machine learning communities, right? So I've known people within them, and so I follow a lot of, you know, stuff that seems relevant and talk to people who seem knowledgeable, and that's sort of where I synthesize most of my perspective from, right? So, you know, the obviously like I work with material objects a lot, and one of the and I've done some work in network infrastructure and stuff like that. So one of the things that's constantly struck me is just like the limitations from an energy standpoint, just the the energy required to flesh out, like build a fully fleshed out model is tremendous. And once you reach the point where you've got something that's say functional to the desired level of um, whatever the product is, like you don't keep running that process, right? You've spent the energy, and then you've built the walls to the deterministic reality that has become that model, and the interface has, you know, is robust enough that people are able to navigate through that. And so you invest all that energy kind of upfront, and then within that model, people are able to bounce around and synergize all kinds of information, but they're not actually able to requery the entire, like, it's not like they can add a new paragraph of data to the database and rerun the entire thing, right? That's not how it works.
Yeah.
But that is actually kind of how we work, right? The human
Oh, yeah,
brain,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
in it,
Interesting.
well, because, you know, you think about the constraints of our natural environment, right? And the ideas of things like combinatorial explosion, right? There's just fundamentally more information than you can process. And it's a probabilistic environment. It's not deterministic. And so that means you're constantly going to be rerunning new information against old information to synthesize a new context and perspective. And if you tried to do a similar kind of process with, you know, a large language model, AI system, or something like that, the compute requirements would be just, you know, massive. And even if you only had one or two or three or four, right? Like if each one of us was trying to replicate, you know, what we do with like what 40 watts or something with our brain, like all the time, like, so when I look at things, some of those kind of things, like I think we should be we should use that kind of a context to get a really clear idea of the tool that we are building, and also at the same time use that context to recognize the ways in which that tool is not a replication of what we are,
Yeah. Yes. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Great.
and maybe not even like really
Yeah.
close,
Just
because
in,
we have such a poor grasp of things like intelligence and consciousness.
and yes, brilliant point. There's a few things. I love this question of how do we get a clear idea of what the tool we are building actually is, and then what are those ways that this tool is not at all close to what we are. And I definitely agree with that. Like I don't think this intelligence is similar to the way that our intelligence works. I think it's a fundamentally different and new thing that, as you said, is a great mirror for us, but is not but it's a great mirror because it's different. In some ways, and then there are other ways that it is kind of similar, but I really like that. But you said something about probabilistic versus deterministic, because it feels like so many of the philosophies that we've come up with as human beings have been so deterministic, particularly the Protestants. And but then I think you're right. It's like probabilistic, and that's a pretty different environment. Like those two things are pretty different.
Completely different.
Yeah.
They're completely different.
Yeah. Let's go into that
Fundamentally.
more. Yeah.
Well, I think a good way to, I'll say, this is the way I contextualize a difference really simply, right? Is like one is something like infinite potential, space, and the other one has boundaries.
Mhm.
Right? An infinite potential space is something that in my mind, like I extend out into my perception of the cosmos, and I can't get it any bigger than that, right? In some sense, right? Like I have no way to hold it separately than that. But whatever's going on there, that we're talking about a probabilistic realm, right? There's no clear boundaries drawn where we can say like these are the limits and this is the end, and this is now we can know because we get a reference from this thing, right? We can measure it or we can delineate it. Whereas, our, I mean, I think one of the reasons that I think the tendency to try to contextualize our reality as a deterministic environment is, it's a part of this progression that's reciprocal with our engagement with reality, right? Like every time we create a new way to observe and measure material, we're able to then kind of create a whole new realm of, say, science in some sense, right? We can start with astronomy, right? And the telescope, and these things, whether we look at things reductionistically in many ways in the materialist framework, right? It's like either larger, farther away, or smaller. Like we're looking for the blocks that things are built of and the boundaries and the rules by which they work. And we're always running up against some limit where we can't do that anymore. But then we just say, okay, well, this is as far as we can measure. The rest of it still all runs this way. So we're going to keep running it this way. And we make all of our assumptions on that. And you can see how this works in something like a video game environment, right? Because a single player video game is a bounded deterministic world environment, even if it's very robust. And I think this is why it's sort of a divergence, right? But I think this is why we so easily get this perception too that we interact with NPCs even in the real world, right? Because I mean, this way I kind of think about it, like the NPC in the real world is someone who's not operating in a probabilistic environment. They're operating deterministically, based off of a framework of propositions that draw the boundaries of truth, right? Whether it's through societal or religious or any other kind of institutions, right? But once you start to really adhere to some propositional boundaries, those become the limits. You can't operate outside of those. And you can run into people who have so tightly drawn those boundaries that your interaction with them mimics that of like an NPC character in a video game. Like you can ask them some questions that have a certain little tree of answer potentials out of them, but there's a lot of other things that if you try to interact with them, like there's nothing there, right? It's outside of their range of
Cognition.
engagement. Well, just engagement, right? Because
Engagement.
like
Interesting. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because the deterministic world is a much safer feeling place because you feel like you know what the limits of like how bad things could get or what could happen today, or how could these other people around you behave, right? What are your expectations for their behavior? And you know um, the truth is we never actually can really predict any of these things very well. Surprisingly, we predict a lot of things fairly well a lot of the time, but the you know the potential for an infinite number of variables to disrupt our predictions is always present.
How does that inform your building of physical things? Because like what I like about talking with you is that you can essentially extrapolate to other things that you haven't been following it. I mean, you've been following AI, you haven't been in AI, working in AI, but everything you said, like I've been working in AI for the past year. I might be doing confirmation bias, but everything you said has been accurate. And so like you're able to take what you're doing in the shop and then apply it to other things. Um, where does that come from? How does it get influenced?
I mean, I guess I like to think that I try to follow up first principles approach to my observation and integration and orientation towards the world. I really think about it a lot like piloting a sailboat. I was fortunate when I was young to have my grandfather teach me how to pilot a small sailboat in, you know, little mountain lakes here in Colorado, right? That's a fairly actually a fairly challenging and adaptive environment to operate a sailboat, because the breeze is, you know, never stable or directionally, you know, it's just always blowing around in the mountains. So the process of, I mean, you need a heading, right? You need some directionality, and you have to choose something, right? So you begin to orient yourself. Like, I think we find ourselves in this world, like once you achieve some level of self-awareness, you just recognize that, like, it's an ocean. I don't know quite really where to go. And so maybe you see some directionality of some other people and you're like, that seems like a good direction. I'm going to point that way. So you have to pick a heading. And when you know, if you're running a tiller on a boat, you're managing the tiller and the sails at the same time, adapting to the water, right? Which is always going to be coming at some sort of an angle and all this, and trying to maintain a direct heading, right? Which means that all of these things actually need to be able to move. And this is why I think that a propositional grasp on the world is suboptimal. It's limiting, right? And not that you can actually get rid of all the propositions, but to the degree that you can orient yourself more by principles with sensitivity to feedback and enough humility to perform course corrections and stuff like that. That's more like the way I would describe what I try to do.
I like that point. I love the propositional point. That factor of understanding reality is so interesting, because I am very good with the propositions. I can formulate a lot of things with the propositions, and then the principles represent something beyond just the propositions. They represent something that is maybe eternal, maybe not. That goes into the kind of the Platonism stuff, though, right? Like, it's just like very the forms, you know, whether there is that essence of the form that exists outside of our own understanding. This is why we're going to learn so much from the LLMs, and why it is such a good mirror.
Oh, they're massively powerful, right? They can leverage aspects of, say, intelligence that we don't I don't think we actually possess.
Yes, this is
I
parasitic
really do,
processing. Yes, yeah,
right? I do think it's a very different thing that we've built actually than what we are.
Yeah.
So this is why I think, like, it's not a thing to be feared or fought necessarily, or like all of these other kind of things, right? It's a thing to be integrated.
Yeah.
It's a question like how well we integrate it, what kind of fruit it will produce. You know, which direction it will lead us, what kind of, because the ability to synthesize insights across such a broad spectrum of information, right? That goes well beyond anybody's experience or ability to, you know, ingest other people's experiences through reading or watching video. There's no way I can expose myself to as much raw information.
Yes.
That's, even if it's been filtered through other people's perspectives, then, you know, then you have access to it in a model like that, right? Like, it's a tremendously powerful tool for moving beyond your own perceptual limitations, and especially if you're not bound by really stringent propositions about what you already think you know to be true, right?
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. So I want to ask you about whether you're actually using the AI to help you in the shop, like whether you're using it as a personal tutor, because that's, for me, that's the main use case that I found, that without fail, the best thing it can do is teach me how to learn about whatever I'm interested in learning. There's something else. Oh yeah, is the propositional versus perspectival knowing. So this
Mhm.
thing's got propositional knowing. For my listeners, that's like facts, linguistic facts. This thing has that, maybe even better than human beings do, or at least in a different way, but very, very good. But it does not, in my opinion, does not have perspectival and participatory knowing. The
So I
ability,
would say
yeah, go for it.
what it does have is it does have a way of perspectival knowing, but we've
Oh,
defined the perspective.
yeah,
That's what we
interesting.
that's what we do when we draw the relevance bounding,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yep,
Is
yep.
we give it a perspective. The thing it absolutely does not have participatory
Yes, yes, got it.
knowing.
Yeah.
And it hmm, could it have performative
Hmm.
knowing? I don't maybe. Um might
Yeah,
have to
that's a good
think
one.
about that a
Yeah,
little
yeah,
bit.
yeah, yeah. Performative. That's a good one.
I mean, performative versus participatory engagement with the world
Hmm.
is one of the ways that for one I try to apply with some sensitivity towards myself to evaluate my own position and orientation and also in evaluating other people
Yep.
because
Yep.
the this I think the fruit of very of having a very tightly deterministically bound perspective of the world is that you perform like an actor in a
Ah,
play,
yeah, interesting.
right? Because that's it's all that those boundaries of those propositional rules
Yeah.
that limit what can be. And so you're always acting to make sure that what's going to be is what can be,
Yeah.
not something that couldn't be, wasn't part of your model, right?
Yeah.
When I think really like if we're participating in the process of creation, in bringing to fruition something new, genuinely new and novel, like that requires a form of participation that's it has to just necessarily be non-propositional. It has to be humble and it has to be observant and integrating and all those things. Like you can't be resistive, you can't be like when you encounter some new information that doesn't jive with your existing model, you're never going to integrate it by fighting it,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yep.
But you also have to have a resiliency towards bad ideas, like all these kind of things, right? Like and the best thing I know to kind of help try to guide that is a deep sense of the principles that underlie all of the things that seem to make up that informational context
Hmm.
of the perspectival.
Yep. Brilliant. So let's go back to that question of are you using it as a tutor?
I'm I haven't really found a super feasible application for it in this exact
Yeah.
um, production here. Like this is just I don't know, some sort of a stop along my way. Like I've done so many different things in my life, and like I didn't set out to start a little custom automotive shop here, but I've been working on this project for 4 years. It'll be a show truck when it's done, and
Wow.
like I
Wow.
take on a couple other projects here and there. But yeah, a project like this it's fully re-engineered, and I'm building a wiring harness for it right now, and like everything is ground up, custom and engineered and application specific. So it requires a broad spectrum of from electrical engineering to mechanical engineering to kind of like hydraulics, plumbing. You do weight balance and stuff for handling and braking, and right, there's just a lot of stuff. If you actually build a vehicle right, there's a tremendous amount of dynamics that go into it.
Yeah. So, but do you already have that knowledge? Or like, when do you reach the limits of your own knowledge to how to build this? And for my listeners, he's got a truck behind him that he's rebuilt, engineered, and I can see the engine and it looks very shiny and like new, basically.
It's a 1950 Chevy half-ton pickup on a custom chassis with a Cummins 4VT turbo diesel in it. Like they never came this way, believe me.
Wait, actually, before we go into that question, how is that turbo diesel different than engines that it did come with?
This truck would have originally come with a 6-cylinder inline gasoline engine that was, carbureted, a single downdraft carburetor, probably produced 90 to 100 horsepower. The original engine was 216 cubic inches. This engine, which I actually pulled out of like an old step van bread truck, right? Um, it's a 4-cylinder version of the 6-cylinder Cummins that came in the Dodge trucks for a long time,
Uh-huh.
the diesel that was in those trucks.
Uh,
So there's a lot of commonly available parts. Uh, it's not a highly engineered engine. Like this thing's been around for 20, 30 years, right? Not as old as the truck, but um, I've done a number of performance modifications to it. And it's coupled with a later model 4-speed automatic overdrive transmission. And, it's uh, I have pretty high standards for the operational capabilities of the vehicles that I build.
Interesting.
I spend a lot of time in racing, in vintage racing, and
Huh.
so I try to incorporate a lot of, where it makes sense, high performance modifications, but it's a street truck. And so I want it to be very drivable. I
Hmm.
want it to have, say, like the cooling capacity to sit and idle with the air conditioning on when it's 120 degrees on the asphalt, right?
Hmm.
And these are not things that are really common attributes of street rods. These things, most of these kind of custom modified cars, especially high performance ones, they overheat all the time, and they're not very fun to drive on the streets and whatnot. So yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, I've loved cars for a long time, um, and built cars for a hobby for, I don't know, since my first car I got when I was 13.
Hmm.
So um, I don't have any formal education in any of it.
So
Like,
let's go back to that question then about how you actually, when you run up to the limits of your knowledge, where do you go
mhm.
to find out what you're needing?
When I was growing up, I was homeschooled,
Hmm.
and so that kind of put me on a path of seeking out,
Yeah.
finding and
Yeah. Yeah.
qualifying information. So when I was young, it was books, and I would find books that were relevant to whatever the project was, and um, just wear them out, right, and try to absorb as much of the information as I could. And um, sometimes those were specific to different vehicles, sometimes it was specific to different systems. Um, I was fortunate to have access to the internet when I was pretty young. And so, in the early days, it was finding information. And then, more recently, in the last 12, 15 years, it's become very much qualifying information
Hmm.
because, it became so cheap for people to just put information on the internet that, uh,
The
you
quality of
know,
the information
there's a
went
lot,
bad.
yeah, deteriorated pretty
Yeah.
quickly, right? So it used to be hard to find. Once it became easy to find, then it became, um, the alpha was in being able to qualify.
Hmm.
So that's where it becomes very helpful to be grounded in first principles,
Yes.
or at least the principles of the systems with which you're dealing.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a great point, I wanted to talk about Brian Rommel's take on how to train an LLM, which I really, really like, which is he went back and got all of the manuals from the 1920s to the 1970s, which were all written like probably much higher quality and just very, very can-do attitude. That was the brilliant part about America. And so I love that because that's like, garbage in, garbage out. That's the principle that basically, like, whatever you prompt the AI with, if it's a garbage prompt, you're gonna get a garbage output. But it also, in terms of actually training the AI too, it's like, what is the data? And OpenAI just went in and scraped the entire internet, most of it, Wikipedia and Reddit and all these different places. I believe they did Reddit too. I'm not sure, but and then what's on there, free for all for information. Like, you just have the limits of the universe in terms of people making stuff up. Um, yeah, what do you think about this? The quality of data.
I think it's probably the easiest thing to recognize when anybody's thinking about what is an LLM, or what are we doing with AI, machine learning. Like, okay, well, what is the actual data that goes into it? How much is there? Is it filtered? Is it qualified? Is it not? Which both can be fine, right? But like the thing that Brian's doing by curating the input of the data set with those kind of materials definitely has a massive impact on the qualitative output of the model when you're done, right? The fact that even if you just add those on top of a web scraped model, right? You're going to be adding that much more weight to those principles, that contextualization, right? That perspectival.
Yeah.
Because that's
yeah, interesting.
The thing that you recognize, or what I see when I read or even watch like some of those informational videos that they were making post World War II, right? Some of these things, like, how does a differential work, right, in a car axle? There's a cool little video about that, and like it's very explanatory on a system that's otherwise can be kind of complex and confusing to people, and you gain a perspective that's actually a perspective from a different time. In a sense, when you engage that content, like the way that it's presented is different than the way you can even imagine it being presented today, regardless of the changes in the capacity to format or the different tools we have for visualizations, right? It's not in that. The thing that's different is not just like the production quality or anything like that. The thing that's different is the way that the information is being presented and engaged.
That's an interesting point, because that goes back to the character. We're all playing a character. And in the deterministic world, we're all playing a character. And so the way that you present something comes from a perspectival understanding, and you share your own perspectival. And now I really get that in terms of the LLM, because that's what the guardrails are, is essentially we're putting the boundaries around this character that we're creating. But it also leads to the question of like, well, there's probably going to be a lot of different characters. And maybe I don't think most of the LLM people are talking about the first thing was okay, OpenAI comes out with theirs. Everybody's like, okay, we're going to train our own model. And then they're like, that costs billions of dollars and a bunch of energy. And they're like, okay, no, we're going to fine tune this model on ours. I guess that's where the fine tuning, the fine tuning process will lead to a bunch of different characters that different people think. But I wonder how much is important about that base layer LLM in terms of the perspectival knowledge. I'm wondering how, like, maybe we will need to train a lot of large language models, and that process will probably get cheaper and cheaper in energy perspective.
I mean, I think it's very necessary to have a plurality of perspectives. I think that maybe in some deep way that's the reason why we experience the world as individuated consciousness.
Interesting. Yep.
But the danger of, say, the centralization is always to preference and bias one model or perspective over others.
Yep.
Right? Like it becomes, say, the oracle of truth. And that's a dangerous place to be, because we never have enough information to build that perspective adequately,
to prepare for the just basic fact that everything changes all the time and everything's in a dynamic state of flux all the time, and it's not deterministic.
And part of that is because we inhabit a biological interface. It has all kinds of its own constraints and demands, and like and all of our salience landscaping, all of our relevance realization is actually because of the interface.
Yes. Yep.
And so that's something that none of these models have and can't actually have. Like we don't know how to to say put
Embody
one
it.
in and
Yeah,
it
yeah,
and
yeah,
to
yeah.
embody it in an exact replica of a human body that's actually going to die in 80 years and
Yeah,
has the same kind
yeah,
of metabolic constraints and like, because there's no way to actually align whatever it sees with what we experience. Like its experience can't mimic our experience without an identical interface. And like you can see how we as humans with, whether you're male, female, what age you are, like where you grew up, like all kinds of things can actually change the way our biological interface is crafting the perspectival
Yes.
contextualization in each individual. And then, through language and other things, we try to, you know, connect those different perspectives and generate something like a collective, which we can do really powerfully with LLMs, right? These are the kind of things that we're able to do maybe more powerfully and effectively than we've ever been able to before. It's synthesize information from a lot of different perspectives.
Super interesting. Okay. A few minutes left. I would love to talk about 3D printing because that's what we were last talking about. So we got 5 minutes left on 3D printing. Anything you've learned recently?
I've not done as much of it this past year, for just, numerous different reasons. Mostly I've been deeply involved in this and
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of application for it in this
So there's no,
necessarily.
okay. So there's no application. What's getting in the way of
You
application?
you could,
Okay.
like, I know a bunch of people who do. Mostly those are choices, aesthetically
Choices.
driven
Yes. Yeah.
choices.
Okay. Yeah.
One of the other aspects of doing a project like this is trying to blend in the aspects of the beautiful,
Yeah.
right?
Interesting.
And maintain something like an aesthetic appeal to, maybe a transcendent aesthetic appeal, right? The whatever it is about beauty that
Mm,
that can reach out and touch anyone,
mm,
regardless of what they say, whether it's a building, whether it's an animal, whether it's a vehicle,
mm.
right? Like the principles there, um, are something I'm trying to tap into as well as I go through,
That's a really good point.
like a full re-engineering and rebuild process like this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like me and my friend were talking about it. I'd be curious about hear what you think. Um, Talking about art in the age of AI and just the if you're gonna create, if the tools become so easy to create, then we deal with the problem that everybody's creating, and then it devalues it just like the information on the internet. But then to make art necessarily isn't necessarily the car behind you. It isn't necessarily the painting or the statue or anything like that. It's the emotional resonance that like somebody suffered or somebody experienced some heavy emotion, and then they put it into that thing to transmit
Hmm.
that feeling. And they do it through technique, and the tools of technique are getting so good, but then we'll just be able to create much easier, and there will still be that transmission process, but it will just be different because the tools have changed. What's your take on that?
Well, it certainly lowers the threshold to expression, like
Mm.
visual expression in a lot of different ways. And the, I mean, from an artistic standpoint, I think it's pretty understandable to see where some people would be concerned or threatened or, um, and maybe even with some legitimacy, right? Like it's one thing to be able to generate a conceptualization of something that you're trying to convey or transmit, like you're talking about that. Like that is the purpose of any of these mediums,
Mm.
right? Is that
Yes.
communication.
Yes. Yeah. Interesting.
Um, but it used to be that, maybe you had to spend 5 or 10 years practicing to draw or paint or sculpt or craft whatever it is that you're going to do to the degree that you could express it, the thing that you felt adequately to where it could be represented in a way that it could be transmitted and someone else can receive it,
Mm.
and without you know without loss, without a significant amount of loss, right? Communication's always,
Lossy. Interesting.
yeah, lossy. So visual stuff tends to be less lossy, right? Than language for sure. But So I can kind of see that there's maybe a little bit of a disenfranchisement there in a sense, right? Because it's like, well, if we're going to use it because it's a new tool, it's a new it's a new tool for everyone at the same time. It doesn't matter if you've been a painter for 50 years or if you're 12 years old, right? Like it just became available for everybody. And it's still a tool. It's not going to take the thing in your mind and transfer it and convey it in a way
For you. Yes. Interesting.
that
Yeah.
achieves your goal unless you're able to communicate with it and use that tool
Yep.
to achieve that outcome. So I think, you're still not going to produce amazing art without having
Hmm.
an authentic, genuine inspiration for it. Right. So it's real art that has like you can't receive something from a piece of art that didn't have it.
Hmm.
Right, like the artist
Yeah.
has to
Yeah. Yeah.
put something in there for you
Yeah.
to get
Yeah.
it out. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so if very little went into it, like there's very little you can take out, and this is
Yes.
kind of what you
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
even
Yeah. Interesting.
with
Yep.
a
Yep.
really compelling and beautiful AI generated image.
Hmm.
Right, it's like it's perfection in its depiction
Yeah.
and like just robust in its like expression. Right, everything's a little bit max.
Yeah.
Right,
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and
Yes.
there's a sort of appeal to that, but it's
Yeah.
like an empty
Interesting.
appeal, right? It's like almost
Yeah.
like a diabolical
Yeah.
representation
Yeah.
because it doesn't convey to you, because it can't convey to you that the soul, right, or
Yeah.
the impetus,
Yeah. Yeah.
the say that brilliance that actually it originated in the mind of the artist. And yet I think with the right application of this tool, the people who have that can probably do more than they've ever been able to do before.
Yep. The level playing field is a very interesting topic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people find out more about you and what you're working on?
Absolutely. I'm pretty low profile digitally these days. I'm mostly active on Twitter, so at Aaron_Lowry on Twitter, and that's probably my highest point of public profile.
Cool. Well, always appreciate talking, and I'm hoping we can do this again.
Yeah, man. Always enjoy it, and it's instructive, insightful, and generative for me as well.